Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the last presentation in the Rogers Tavern Museum Spring Lectures. My name is Jennifer Pitts, an independent museum consultant working with the town of Perryville at the Rogers Tavern Museum. The museum is situated along the banks of the beautiful Susquehanna River in Perryville, Maryland. We're located approximately 43 miles from Baltimore City and 34 miles from Wilmington, Delaware. The Susquehanna Lower Ferry and an ordinary was formally established by the Maryland Colonial Government in 1695 on both sides of the Susquehanna River because of its location on a major overland transportation route connecting the eastern and southern colonial capitals and seaports. The building that became known as Rogers Tavern was built sometime in the 1740s and provided a place for travelers to eat and rest, and for locals to conduct business, catch up on the news of the day, and enjoy drinking with coworkers and friends, until about the 1880s, when it ceased operation as a tavern/hotel/summer boarding establishment and was converted into a duplex housing unit. Rogers Tavern was saved from demolition by the organization now known as Preservation Maryland in 1954. The Friends of Rogers Tavern subsequently formed to renovate the building with the goal to return it to its 18th century appearance. Placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1972, it was purchased by the town of Perryville in 1993. The mission of the Rogers Tavern Museum is to preserve and share the imitable stories of all who lived, worked at, and visited this vital link along an important roadway in America's early history through dynamic, engaging experiences that encourage exploration of our area's rich cultural and natural legacy. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Sara Rivers Cofield, who is the Curator of Federal Collections at the Maryland Archaeological Conservation Laboratory at Jefferson Patterson Park Museum, a position she's held since 2004. Her specialty is the study of small finds, especially metal artifacts. Sara is currently finishing a $25,000 grant from the Conservation Fund to add new research on equestrian artifacts to the Mac Lab's Diagnostic Artifacts in Maryland website. Welcome, Sara.
All right, well, thank you for having me to talk about this grant research that I've been working on. I have a lot of slides, so I may talk a little bit fast, but as I understand it, we're going to have a little bit of a Q&A at the end. I've been working on studying horse-related artifacts since at least 2011. 2007 is probably when I started. And so there's a lot to talk about. So if I go over something, make a note and put questions and comments, anything like that, and I'll be happy to answer at the end. So as Jen said, I'm the Curator of Federally Owned Collections at the Mac Lab. The Mac Lab is in St. Leonard, Maryland. I'm in Calvert County, and it has most of the archaeological collections from the state of Maryland that are driven by laws, archaeology that is required by law, like for highways going in and construction projects and things like that. We have about 10 million artifacts, or 10,000 boxes of artifacts, and the federally owned ones are about 10%. That's what I'm responsible for. So I work on those, but I also like to do research on collections, and my specialty is little metal things. And as I was studying little metal things, it turned out a lot of them were horse related. So I'm not a horse person. I've ridden a couple of times, but like I've clocked maybe 3 hours total in my life on horseback. So I really got into this by studying artifacts. And as Jen said, we have this website called Diagnostic Artifacts in Maryland. And it's where we put up artifacts that are distinctive, that with descriptions, with scholarly essays, so that people can identify artifacts that they find. And the public does use it from time to time for ceramics they find in their garden or things they find on the beach. But it's very much used by archaeological practitioners to help them date their finds and to write their reports. And in fact, Jen volunteers with us and has been working on adding some sections on utensils. So the sections that I'm adding have a lot to do with equestrian artifacts lately, but I've added other small finds too. So metal artifacts also includes things that are clothing related, like cufflinks and smokers' companions and bodkins, and so there are some non-horse related things I've added. But this is a little bit of a teaser of some of the artifacts that I'll be talking about. But before I get into the artifacts themselves, because they're kind of fragmentary and they need a lot of explanation, and then also for general audiences, I think sort of the general history is a little bit more interesting sometimes than the minutia of the artifacts. I'm going to lay the groundwork about what makes Chesapeake horse culture so unique, because that's really what gives these artifacts meaning. And Chesapeake horse culture is a very unique thing that developed in the 17th century. And by the way, there's 3 cats running around me, so if you hear weird things in the background, I'm trying to block them out with Bluetooth, and I don't know how effective that will be. So if they interrupt, I apologize. All right, so the goals of this grant are to add more to the existing sections that are already on diagnostic artifacts, which are leather ornaments or ornaments that decorate bridles, especially some of the horse tack that's front facing, also bosses for curb bits, stirrups, and spurs. Those are already on the website. And I'm going to add, I've visited Historic St. Mary City, Jamestown, Colonial Williamsburg, and the Virginia Department of Historic Resources, which is our state counterpart in Virginia, to access their collections so that I can add things from their collections to these existing sections from our collections. So that's one goal of the grant. And then another goal is to add new sections on horseshoes, bits, artifacts of horse care, and if there's time, artifacts related to driving vehicles. But as it turned out, vehicles weren't much of a thing in colonial Maryland, so I didn't find many artifacts related to that. And in the lead up to this grant, one of the things I really focused on during the pandemic was all of the background research. And in order to understand the background of horse culture in colonial Maryland and Virginia, you have to understand what's going on with horse culture in England, because that's where most of the people are coming over and bringing their horses. Horses were not something that were already here before European contact in this part of the country. While the Spanish did bring some over with their various explorations, they weren't a thing in Maryland and Virginia yet. So the Jamestown settlers brought them with them, and basically the English settlers had to bring their own. So in England in the 17th century, when all of this is getting started, the main uses of saddle horses were for travel and exercise, or just riding in general, warfare, hunting, and racing. So there's a little bit of utility to the saddle horse, and then there's also a lot of leisure to the saddle horse, and then there's the, the warfare element, which fortunately I don't have to get into a whole lot with the colonial Maryland and Virginia horses. And then there's also in England at this time use of horses in harness, for plowing and agriculture, for carting heavy loads, and carriages, coaches, chaises, travel, essentially. That was very much a thing in England already by the 17th century. In England in the 17th century, the horse ownership was really quite expensive, because for one thing, not everybody was landed gentry, and so you needed land to pasture your horse, and there were some commons for that, but you still had to be able to afford a horse to be able to afford the feed for a horse, especially in the off season when there wasn't a lot of grass in the winter. You had to be able to afford all of the horse tack, the purchase price of the horse, stabling, pasturing, all of that. And then also, because horses kept in commons or in common stables, if you didn't have land of your own in your own stable, were in a communal environment, they were fairly prone to disease. So the farrier bill or the vet bill was usually fairly high if you had to keep your horse in a communal kind of situation. So in England at this time, there was really this hierarchy of horse ownership. So the nobility and the wealthiest classes could have specialized horses for riding, hunting, racing, drawing their carriage and coach, having 4 exact matching color and height horses to draw their coach, and having completely separate horses for agricultural work and for the servants to ride, etc. In the landed middle classes or the well-to-do tradespeople, they would probably have saddle horses and work horses and a stable servant. Lower classes would probably have one single all-purpose horse that could pull the cart and ride you to town, and pull the plow. And then the lowest classes, the majority of people couldn't afford a horse at all. So that's what was happening in England when the colonies started. And a quick aside overview in terms of colonization, the British colonies, like I said, they had to bring the horses themselves. The Spanish had brought some horses over, and so they had them in Florida, they had them in Mexico, South America, and they were spreading up the West Coast. But what we found and what scholars have generally found is that those horses stayed west of the Mississippi. And so what happened is that during colonization, you have this one type of culture from Spain, which is really heavily influenced by Arabian, North African influence from all of the Moorish wars in Spain. They have this very different tradition, very decorative, of horse tack, and they use a different kind of bit than English riding. And to this day, those horses stayed out west and developed, the Spanish developed into Western riding, and then the English riding pretty much stayed the same. The two never really mixed a lot, even though they both ended up transported to this country. And really, it wasn't until the 19th century, after industrialization, that both traditions were sort of available to everybody, and you had this kind of Western tradition based on the Spanish colonies and the English tradition based on the English colonies, and they kind of stuck to their styles. But before any of that could happen, somebody had to bring horses over on ships, and that is no small feat. So here's a picture that shows you how horses had to come over. They usually had to be in a sling. They needed to be able to stand up for the most part for their health. So they would have a trough. They would be in a sling for the duration of the trip. There you can see the hooves are tied up at the front, so they're not like sliding around and hurting their legs. So this takes up quite a bit of space in a ship. A lot of these ships aren't terribly large. And you would have to have all of the feed and the water and everything to keep the horse alive for the fairly long journey. So it was an expense. And my research has shown that 7 horses came over in the original, one of the Jamestown shipments. And almost as soon as they arrived, the first 7 horses in Jamestown, they arrived right before what was called the starving time, and so they were eaten. And then another couple of horses were imported before 1620, and then there was a huge American Indian attack in 1622, and whenever relations with the Indians were bad, starvation happened because people really relied on their agriculture and training for corn. So they ate those horses too. And really, it wasn't until 1650 and after that you had, even as late as 1650, there was maybe 1 horse for the top 1% of colonists in Virginia and Maryland. So they were really quite valuable before 1650 because this is a complex thing, getting a horse over here. So as an example, the very first horses that we know of in Maryland are owned by Leonard Calvert. He was the first governor of Maryland, and his father was Lord Baltimore. So he had the charter and everything. When he died in 1647, his probate inventory listed 3 stone horses, 3 mares, and 1 stone colt for worth 8,400 pounds of tobacco. Contrast that with his large framed house with 100 acres of townland was worth less than half of what his horses were worth. And his large house with 3 manors belonging to it, and a manor is something like 1,200 acres or something ridiculous like that. That was worth 7,000 pounds. So the horses were really worth a lot. They were the only horses in the colony at the time. And when he died, there were various court cases of people sort of fighting over who had been promised these horses. Importantly, if you're wondering what a stone horse is, that refers to a male horse that still has its stones, that is not a gelding, which is a castrated horse. And that's significant because they're trying to raise the population of horses in this area. So clearly they've got a matching set of male-female horses to try to get the population up. All right, so in the 1660s and 1670s, everything really changes a lot, both for horses and for Maryland and Virginia in general. So by this time, wars with the American Indians have really mostly calmed down. There are conflicts here and there, but there is security for the colonists. They're not constantly worrying about invasions. They don't have to build palisades around their plantations. People are spreading out a lot on all the waterways. Tobacco has become the main cash crop, and everybody has figured that out. And the settlement pattern becomes established by this tobacco plantation system. And the Navigation Acts have also happened by this time, and that means that England basically has taken control over trade. So there was a lot of unrest during the English Civil War and during the early colonial period. But by the 1660s, 1670s, there has been the restoration of Charles II. Politics are calming down. England is taking control, and England really controls all the trade. The Dutch aren't doing a whole lot anymore, except for a little bit of smuggling. And then also in this time, the English populations really boom in both Maryland and Virginia. Oh, I'm so sorry, that's a cat toy. England had a lot of people flee during the English Civil War to Maryland and Virginia, especially if they were royalists. So that caused kind of a big population boom. And a lot of those people who came had the culture of the horse ingrained in them because they tended to be royalists. They tended to support the royal family. And so they were feeling a little uncomfortable under Cromwell. And so a lot of them chose to come to the colonies. And they brought with them that sort of mental picture of horsemanship and horse ownership. And so it was a priority for them to have horses. In this settlement pattern, people needed a fair amount of land to grow tobacco because it depleted the soils fairly quickly. So, when people settled on new plantations, they divided them roughly into thirds. So 1/3 would stay in forest, another third in meadow for livestock to graze, and another third for growing tobacco and corn. And what they would do when they were growing the tobacco and the corn is they would clear fields by felling the trees, but they would kind of pretty much leave the stumps in place and the roots in place to rot on their own instead of trying to haul them out. So all of the tobacco cultivation and the corn cultivation in this time period was done by hand. So you didn't need horses to pull plows at this time. It wasn't a practical approach. And what would happen is those stumps would take, 10, 20 years to rot before you could even think about pulling a plow. So in these early plantations, you didn't have a drive to have a plow. And once they did start doing plowing a couple generations in, they often had oxen doing it. So horses aren't really being put to the plow in this region in the 17th century on a regular basis. So the tobacco and the corn, they're grown in these little hills made by hand hoeing, and this style of settlement, instead of requiring fencing to keep livestock in, what they would do is they would create fencing to keep livestock out of the crop area. So they would build a fence around the crops to keep the livestock out. And then they pretty much let the livestock roam free. So the horses, the pigs, the cows, they're running around in the woods, in the meadow, and they usually have some kind of mark on their ear or something to indicate whose it is. And if any of you have ever looked into research of this time period, there are endless court cases about stray animals wandering onto somebody's property and damaging something, or wandered away and somebody kept it and they want it back. That kind of thing was a constant problem. So with pretty much all of the planters in this region having grazing land and forests, an abundance of vegetation that grew in this environment, colonists in the Chesapeake didn't really have to bother with animal feed like they did in England. So you would give your horse, your cow, you know, you maybe would give them a little bit of corn, but the corn grew fairly easily here, so that wasn't a very big deal. You didn't have to have them have the winter over kind of oats and like that constant supply of food and hay. So they didn't have as much expense in terms of feed, they just let them wander. And also the climate is much more temperate here than in England. So plantation owners didn't really bother with stables. They just didn't need them. Everybody had multiple sort of posting ground in permanent architecture buildings, and everybody would have had to have a tobacco barn. And so if weather was particularly bad, you could take the livestock and put them in your tobacco barn or your other sheds, outbuildings, corn houses, things like that. But having devoted stables was really rare. And also the soil in the area is a nice clay soil, and it's not stony in all of these tidewater regions where the plantations are. So people didn't have to bother to shoe their horses. They could just kind of keep the hooves filed and manicured, and they didn't have to bother with shoeing. They also, whoops, sorry about that. Also, because the animals could kind of roam free and have plenty of space, they weren't in these communal areas where they were catching a lot of diseases, so you didn't have to have a lot of farrier bills. And all of those things contributed to this incredible cost savings, so that everybody in the Chesapeake who wanted to have a horse could pretty much afford to have a horse. So by the time they solved the shipping issue and there was enough natural reproduction, there was this huge explosion in population of horses. So at some time between 1650 and 1670, instead of the laws saying you can't export a mare, you can't export any horses, the laws started saying, okay, no more imports of horses, or we need to start having better fences against horses, or there's all these free roaming horses and it's okay to shoot them if they eat your apples 3 times. Those kinds of laws started passing, and it happens pretty fast. In a period of about 20 years, there's this huge explosion. And of course that makes sense when you think about the fact that all of these horses are free roaming. They initially wanted a lot of horses, so you have stallions and mares free roaming and mating at will, and at that rate you can have each mare can potentially have a colt like every year. So the population grew, and that meant everybody could have a horse. So what would happen on these plantations is that the crops would be packed into hogsheads and rolled. So again, the horses, even though everybody could have one, they're really still not needed for the plantation operation. They're not needed to pack the tobacco or to ship the tobacco. That was all done by water and by rolling hogsheads to ships. The other thing that this region didn't really have is towns. So While it did have designated towns, port towns, certainly by the 1680s, you had designated towns where people would have to gather their tobacco. So the merchants didn't have to go to each individual plantation. A town was basically like it was a courthouse, a jail, an ordinary or a tavern, where people would stay, and it was a gathering place. And so whenever court was in session, everybody would gather and they would stay overnight and they would party, and then they would all go home. It wasn't really a population center because the plantations were dispersed. So because of that, and because of this dispersed pattern, you really needed your horse to be a saddle horse, to be a riding horse. So in terms of roads to travel from plantation to plantation, or to court and town to do business, travelers' descriptions of the colonies basically say that the forests were easily passable because they didn't have a lot of undergrowth. They were old growth forests. There weren't a lot of branches to block progress, so you could just kind of ride through the woods, and there were a lot of existing deer trails. So it was really easy to just ride through the woods on horseback. You still couldn't pull like a vehicle through these woods because they weren't formalized roads. And what they would do basically is they had they would kind of debark the trees to sort of mark the trails for the main thoroughfares. And then if you were just going to see your friends on their private plantation, you just kind of had to know the way. And one thing that I think is important to clarify for this region is that certainly by the end of the 17th century, a fair amount of the population was enslaved Africans. And one of the things I had to factor in terms of my study of equestrian artifacts was, how do I factor horse population versus human population in terms of who is actually riding? And so I needed to know, did enslaved people actually ride horses, and what kind of horse equipment would they have? And essentially all of the research that I've found indicates that people did indeed put their enslaved laborers on horses. So everybody in Maryland and Virginia at this time is riding a saddle horse. It was just a universal thing. When you got together to go to court or to go to church, everybody rode their saddle horse. Everybody had one. Races would spontaneously happen. It just became part of the culture. And so it was kind of like a universal thing, sort of like how nowadays we all drive our cars everywhere. They always rode their horses. And the accounts talk about people riding at a planter's pace, which was really fast. And for all of those reasons, if you're going to town or you're going to court and you have an attendant who is enslaved, you have to put them on horseback too. They can't walk next to you because everybody was riding fast. And so there are various probate inventories also that indicate, like, if there are quarters that are further out and they're listing things, they would list, oh, at this quarter is all these possessions, and then also these enslaved individuals and these horses that are separate. So they would have their own horses designated, and they were part of this equestrian culture. One of my favorite accounts of the enslaved and the horse related stuff that was going on in this time is that because racing was so popular, when everybody got together, apparently the enslaved population, the races were really a chance for them to sort of let loose. They all really enjoyed the races. They got to watch them too. The races were limited to the gentry. So you had to be like the owner of the horse in order to make a bet, because you had to be able to make good on the bet and that kind of thing. And so there's some really interesting accounts of travelers talking about how the slaves are watching these races and really cheering when the races would get kind of violent and competitive. And if one of the owners fell off the horse and broke a leg, like, nobody cheered louder than some of the slaves who were there. It was sort of a chance for them to be able to let loose. And I think that's a really interesting part of horse culture to look at. So another thing that is noteworthy at this time period is that the American Indians in the region did not have horses at this time. And in fact, they really made fun of all of the Europeans for their dependence on horses, because it was like they weren't capable of walking. You never saw people walking anywhere. And they basically, there's comments about the Indians saying, oh my gosh, I can't believe how lazy they are, that, you know, 2 legs are too many for lazy people that can't visit their closest neighbor without 6 legs. You know, they're making fun of them for riding everywhere. But at the same time, the European accounts of things and of the Indians not having horses say things like, oh, well, they don't cause us any trouble anymore, because every time they pester an outlying plantation, we all just get on horseback and chase them down and arrest them. So while on the one hand, the Europeans are being made fun of for their dependence on horses, the horses are really enabling them to take over the region and to chase people down and push them out of their area. It gives them a dominance that they maybe wouldn't otherwise have had. But in terms of the archaeological sites that we have from this period that are American Indian population sites, during European contact, we don't get horse-related artifacts at those sites. All right, so let's get into the artifacts a little bit. So we know now saddle horses were widely used, horses were affordable for everyone, and not much effort was put into horse care. So what do the artifacts have to tell us? And so I've given you the background on Chesapeake horse culture, and the next step is to do background on the artifacts themselves and how do they get here and who is making them and all of that. And we're going to go fairly quickly through this because I have a lot of background on this. And a lot of it I got actually at Winterthur, which is up kind of closer to where you guys are than to where I am down in Calvert County. But this is sort of answering the questions that archaeologists have. Who made these artifacts? Where were they made? How did they arrive in the colonies? How were they distributed, and how much choice did consumers have? And can we tell things like, this person was rich because they have X kind of horse related thing, and this person was not because they didn't. And so those are sort of the nitty gritty of what I'm going to get into now. So based on my research, what I found is that you need to think of a saddle. Remember, we have mostly saddle horses, so we can put aside all of the vehicle stuff and harness and just think of saddle and tack, so bridles and saddles. And a saddle is a pretty complex piece of furniture made in lots of different parts. It has a wooden frame that is generally made by joiners or carpentry side of things. That is built up with metal gullets that reinforce it. And then it's covered with various kinds of upholstery, leather, padding. All of those things are made by different people. So the metal parts are made by a trade in England called Lorrainers. This is a word that didn't even really make it over the colonies because Lorrainers weren't really practicing here. It goes back to the medieval period, at least in Europe and the UK. In France, they were called spurriers. But they're the people who make all the metal parts. So the bits, the buckles, the stirrups, the ornaments, all of that, spurs. Joiners or carpenters made the wooden trees, cloth weavers, dyers made a lot of the upholstery, leather tanners made leather straps, and saddlers just did the assembly. So they aren't making the raw materials, they're doing the assembly. And then things like horseshoes are the blacksmith and the farrier. So if you think that blacksmiths are making all of this horse related stuff, they're not. They would make horseshoes when we needed horseshoes. But remember, we don't really need that before 1750 because there weren't really roads yet and people had nice clay soils. So most of this metal stuff is being made by Lorrainers in England. This is just some pictures of the worshipful company of Lorrainers that go back to the medieval period. And one of the things I found looking at the Winterthur archives is that places like Pennsylvania and New England, where there are more towns and there are more tradespeople, they had saddlers in those areas, and they were doing assembly here in the colonies, but they still imported the metal stuff. So the metal stuff is all coming from England. And that's what archaeologists find. So you might have assembly in Pennsylvania, but you're still finding English-made metal artifacts. And then I looked at Winterthur at the English customs records from 1700 to 1770. I checked like every 10 years to look for the imports and where they're coming from and what's going on. And remember, England has total control over trade by this time because of the Navigation Acts. And so based on the customs records, all smuggling aside, bridles, saddles, chariots, coaches, harness collars, but primarily bridles and saddles are being exported. They're made in England and they're being exported to the colonies. And they're all of English manufacture. The customs records say if it's foreign manufacturer, English manufacturer, and they're all English manufacture. And Maryland and Virginia got more by thousands than all of the other colonies. And this speaks to this really unique Chesapeake horse culture that developed here, because again, everybody is spread out. They all have saddle horses. They hardly have to maintain them, but they need them in order to visit and to socialize and to race and do their thing. But people in the tobacco colonies are not stopping growing their tobacco to make saddles like people are in New England and Pennsylvania and some of the other colonies. So the metal goods are sort of hidden in the customs records when they're going to New England and Pennsylvania, because they just did metal by weight, whereas finished saddles and bridles were listed. And so you can see that they're coming in by the thousands every year into Maryland and Virginia. What that tells me is that this created a huge market in England. So this is English mercantile system at work. It totally worked for them. They had to hire and train a bunch more saddlers, and they employed a whole bunch of English people to make things specifically for this market. You can tell based on various newspaper ads how rare it is to have a locally made saddle, because in one advertisement, somebody describes a Virginia-made saddle as it being something that would be so distinctive that you would tell that it's different. And then the other thing in the newspapers is that strayed or stolen horses are described, and so that you can know, oh, I found this horse or I lost this horse. And they often have saddle sores. A saddle is supposed to be made and custom fit to fit over the withers, the shoulders, the back of the horse. If it doesn't fit right, you're going to get saddle sores. And because finished saddles are what are being imported and used over here, they're not custom fit. And so people are buying off the boat. They're having to make do with the closest fit they can get. And so you get a lot of horses with saddle sores over here. In terms of the kinds of saddles that come over here, it is, it might surprise some people, but some of them were velvet, some of them were trimmed with metallic embroidery, like literally silk thread wrapped in silver ribbons, like microscopic, but metallic thread embroidery. So plush seats trimmed with silver and all furniture. Blue plush side saddle trimmed with silver and all furniture. These are things that are coming over according to some bills of lading. I feature on this particular slide the super fancy ones because I think that's not what people picture when they think of colonial tobacco colonies. But there also would be like listed in a hogshead 12 hunting saddles. That's probably like your generic saddle stacked by the dozen, and a hunting saddle is an English saddle. So they probably fit like Pringles in those hogsheads for shipping. But some of these are just amazing in terms of their description. So we have things that run the gamut, the really nice ones and the everyday ones. However, one of the main things I discovered in this research is that the things that we find archaeologically, the ornaments, the bits, the buckles, all of that is not what sets a nice saddle apart from an everyday saddle. It's the upholstery. So a plush or a velvet saddle versus your everyday leather saddle, your pigskin saddle, or plain saddle, canvas, whatever, with the metallic embroidery, that sets it apart. Unfortunately, that's not what we find as archaeologists. So really what we're seeing is mostly this sort of universal metallic stuff that's on all of the bridles and saddles, so we can't necessarily tell class by looking just at the artifacts. All right, so get into the artifacts a little bit, and I'm going to go pretty fast through these. Saddles, what we find is not the wooden parts. We find these iron pieces called gullets, and I don't know if you can see this up here. I'm pointing at it with my cursor. So there's a wooden base. The wooden base is covered with canvas and then riveted. And we do find these saddle gullets archaeologically. This is what they tend to look like. And we have various configurations of them. When I add them to the website, I'll be able to tell you based on the configuration, is it a front gullet or a rear gullet? And also, is it a side saddle gullet? I have seen a number of these in the collections already to be able to help suss out which are women's saddles versus men's saddles, which is always exciting for archaeologists. We love to be able to find gendered artifacts. Another artifact category that came out in my research is called a civet. I did not know this was a thing, but it's a horse related thing. These always get cataloged by archaeologists as buckles, but in fact they are a buckle frame that hangs from an iron band that attaches to the arms of the saddle, and so it is a saddle part. It is not a true buckle. What these do is that straps hang from the civets off of the saddle tree, and you can see them down here. I don't know if I can use my cursor to show you down here. These straps hang from the civet, and the straps that hang from the civet from the saddle tree are the ones that you attach the girth straps to, which go under the belly to hold the saddle on. When the saddle tree is fully covered in canvas, you don't even see the metal bands of civets once, according to some of these period artworks. Another saddle part we find are stirrup bars. These are the bars that the stirrups hang off of from the saddle tree. It's a pretty distinctive thing, and generally speaking, these get cataloged as like architectural hardware or unidentified hardware, and so that's why we're adding them to the website. And then occasionally we find a saddle pommel, although these are rare in this time period. And one of the reasons for that is that there's an evolution of saddles happening at this time. You're going from kind of this old medieval style that's kind of the jousting saddle to the new English saddle. And that evolution is happening in this time period. And the pommel is only still being used on a saddle that's a training saddle that has really high battens to keep people in the saddle. Because according to some really great period sources, they talk about how that pommel was causing bodily injury for people who landed wrong, so they stopped using it. So this is great for us archaeologically, because when we find these pommels, we know we either have an old-fashioned saddle or somebody is training horses, and that's really nice to be able to tell. In terms of the English saddle, we can usually tell if it's an English saddle, which is developed initially as a hunting saddle to give people more range of motion for jumping, by finding these saddle nails, it looks like a button, but it's actually got an iron nail shaft in the back of it instead of a loop to attach it to clothing. And these would have been nailed into the saddle tree, but from the outside of the saddle. So this turns out to be a very diagnostic artifact, indicating that you have the presence of an English saddle. There would be 4 saddle nails per English saddle. We find lots of stirrups. They tend to be kind of boring and all look the same. Although there's one exception, stirrup from Addison Plantation. That's just so cool. And it's one that we didn't know what it was for the longest time, and it took me 12 years to figure out, oh, that's what that is, and it was a really great day. Also find lots of bits. So this trade card that you see over here is showing you the two different kinds of bridles that are being imported in bulk. One is a snaffle bridle and the other is a curb bridle. And the snaffle bridle is very simple, just a couple of buckles and a snaffle bit. And this is used for various applications. Some horses were always ridden on a snaffle. But the sort of the on-trend thing, the full dress horse at this time period was the curb bit horse. And you could actually put both the snaffle bridle and the curb bridle on the horse at the same time, if you so chose. But the curb bridle has most of the equestrian artifacts that we find are from curb bridles. They're parts of curb bits, ornaments that go on the bridles, the buckles. Some of these bridles have 10 buckles per bridle, all matching, and little strap loops to attach the straps, and they have very fancy bosses. So we find chains, we find the iron parts, we find the bosses, lots of little pieces of these. One of the great things about these, although I mentioned earlier that what sets different saddles and bridles apart is the material, not so much the style, it turns out that the styles tell time. So the more elaborate molded styles with open work are pre-1720. This sort of plain dome with a nipple is either 17th or 18th century, and then in the 18th century this plain dome style really dominates, and so we are able to tell time and have diagnostics by using the artifacts, even though we can't necessarily tell high class, low class, fancy, not fancy. It's much more fancy means older. And the same is true for the ornaments that decorate the bridles, which typically match the curb bits, the bosses. We find the same styles across sites, which is further evidence of how those English saddlers stepped up production, and they're just sort of mass dumping popular styles into the Maryland and Virginia market. And pretty much everybody has the same kinds of ornamentation on their horses. So these are the earlier styles. In this slide, the plain, the molded styles tend to have arrow ornaments, rose-shaped ornaments, molded and open work ornaments. And then later styles tend to be a little bit more streamlined, a little bit more plain. This follows decorative arts trends at the time, where you go from the Baroque period to the William and Mary style to the Queen Anne style. Things are sort of getting a little bit more plain over time. And also what's happening in horses at the time is that people are going from setting their horse apart by dressing it up in really elaborate velvet and embroidery to wanting to set themselves apart by having a horse with a perfect physique. They're using breeding and thoroughbreds and bloodlines to set the horse apart. And so the English saddlery is really getting much plainer over time and much more minimal and not really being featured so much. So that trend is kind of a mixed blessing for us. Like I said, it has a lot of interpretive value for dating, but not necessarily for telling us a lot about class and things like that. But overall, it's really nice to be able to compare two sites and say, oh, hey, both of these have pretty much the exact same kind of thing. We're seeing the imports coming over and being spread out, and it's helping us tell time. It's really telling us what an influence the tobacco colonies had on the English economy at the time. And some of the records I have talk about how once you get up to the Revolutionary War and people start boycotting, one of the more outspoken sectors of English society saying, hey, you need to make those Americans happy again, we need to sell our stuff, was the saddlers. They were like, we're gonna have to lay people off, you need to make those Americans happy and start selling them stuff again. And so it's very interesting to me that not only did English traditions influence Chesapeake horse culture, but Chesapeake horse culture became so unique and so universal that then it influenced English economy in a really big way. So that is the end of my slides. I do have other slides, but I am out of time if we are going to have any questions. So should I stop sharing the screen? I can't hear you, Jen.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute.
That's cool.
Wow, thank you so much, Sarah. That was really, really, really good. Really appreciate that.
Thank
Well, I think I have a personal interest because I have a horse myself, but you know, just working in a tavern, and you never really stop to think about you know, how people go. Yeah, how do people
right.
you know, you just tend to think, well, okay, so there's always been carts and wagons and people walked and
Nope.
rode and oxes and ox carts and everything else. So I think I have an interpretive panel I need to rewrite. Thank you. But that's
well, it depends. It depends on the time period. So remind me when Rogers Tavern was started.
So it's kind of interesting. So 1695 is when the Maryland
Okay.
legislature actually formally establishes a tavern, a ferry crossing, and an ordinary on both sides of Susquehanna. So it's in
Okay.
County and it's in Harford County
Right.
at Havre de Grace.
Yes.
So it's like right at the mouth of the Susquehanna River where it
Uh-huh.
meets the Chesapeake Bay. So that indicates that there was enough travel over land that there was a requirement for
Yes.
ease of crossing, relatively speaking. So something's been crossing here since 1695, and we do have illustrations of ferry boats from the 18th century, you know, relatively large flat boats that are just large enough for 1 or 2 horse carriage, and then the carriage itself, and maybe a couple of people. So they're maybe what, 60 feet long, thereabouts?
Yeah. Yeah, and you do yeah, you do, you know, certainly by the 18th century, you're starting to get more vehicles, right? Because in the 1660s, 1670s, you know, people are still, they don't really have that, they still have that undeveloped land, you know, they still have the stumps and the roots and all that. And they do start to branch out a little bit more and do more grain agriculture and things like that. So for example, probably of interest to you guys, I'm just did an exhibit on Old Baltimore, which was the first county seat of Baltimore, which is in Harford County. It's on Aberdeen Proving Ground, so that's up in you guys's like area. And that was an ordinary, a tavern site and a ferry crossing. And there's a lot of horse related stuff in that collection, but his probate inventory also included like wheat. So there certainly is, I think, some carting starting, like people had carts, but not necessarily like vehicles. So one of the things I had to learn that was so over my head was that a cart is a 2-wheeled vehicle. So picture like the poles. You can have a person pull a cart, you know, and you can just kind of take it out in the fields, stack up the tobacco and like roll it back out, right? But a wagon, a 4-wheeled vehicle, that is something you're going to have an animal pull, whether it's an ox or a horse. And yes, certainly once you get into the 18th century, you have more of that happening, and you have a lot of acts to improve roads happening in Maryland law. And so it's on the rise. Yeah. And you probably have some hotbed areas where that's happening. So like around Annapolis in the 1690s, you are going to have roadways and you start to see horseshoeing and things. And maybe up in the Baltimore area, you have kind of a similar thing starting too. But down where I am, more in the Tidewater, Southern Maryland, we're not seeing that because there wasn't a lot of road development. So it really is very specific to your area. Anyway, but yeah, I wouldn't rewrite those panels just yet, because it could be that your particular location had some of that going on. And I can say that ordinaries, taverns, if you have that license, certainly by the time period you guys are operating, the license included not only what the set price was for meal and all the different drinks, but also in order to have a license, you had to have accommodations for like 20 horses and feed for the horses, and that also was at a set price. And it kind of talks about stabling, which I think gave people the impression that everybody had stables, but I don't really think that's what's going on. I think that a lot of these ordinaries had like a set parcel of land where they would lead the horses to or something, and then they could give them the feed and everything. I don't think they had stables that could hold 20 horses, because we just don't find those archaeologically. And they're not in the records, like, oh, there's a stable for 20 horses. It's not the same thing. It's probably a tobacco house that when court is in session, they stick horses in there from time to time.
So that's interesting, because in 2020 we did a non-invasive archaeological survey of what was parceled off in 1804 as a 4-acre tavern and ferry lot. And we think, based on historic maps, that the stable is underneath our parking lot.
No.
So there really was,
Yeah.
so there was definitely a stable here. And we know that a horse got stolen out of it in 1778, which
Oh, well, yeah, certainly by that
description.
time. So like,
Mhm.
so what I'm talking about is like sort of pre-1720. And then once you hit 1720, it's really hit or miss. And by 1750, stables are more common and taverns are more likely to have an actual devoted stable structure. And certainly by the time the Rev War is happening and by the early 19th century, that infrastructure is much more in place and much more set. So it changes. I mean, I guess it's not really that fast because it's like over 100 years, but it changes. So one of the challenges I've been having with this research is how to write it up, because it's really different writing about 1670 than 1770. It's a completely different picture. And I sort of assumed that the 17th century was kind of the same. And then I went to Jamestown and it blew my mind because everything was completely different. I almost didn't recognize the artifacts there. And so I was like, wow, a whole lot happened between 1607 and 1660 that I am not recognizing.
Yeah, well,
Anyway.
what struck me the first time that I saw some of the equestrian artifacts at the Mac Lab was some things really haven't changed.
Yeah, right.
The basic form and function, of the curb bit really hasn't changed. The form and function of a stirrup really hasn't changed, except for now we have safeties and breakaways, and they're more ergonomically designed. But the basic forms really don't change. So we do have some questions in the chat. So if you do have
yeah,
questions,
I'm looking at them right now. Do you want me to just take those on? The second one is, will there be a recording for later viewing? And I believe the answer is yes.
Yes, it is.
So Jeremy Freeman. So the question is about, are there good references for equestrian material, culture, horse tack, bridles, etc.? It depends on the time period. For the colonial period, there really isn't. But I might write one for English, very specifically English colonial. Like I have enough that I could do that right now. But this is something a lot of people ask for, and other than like one chapter in an Ivor Noel Hume book, there's not a lot out there. And so I think that there is demand for it. I think more people would be interested if I included the 19th century, but by the time you get into that period, you can look at catalogs, Sears catalogs, C.M. Mosman company, there's more industrialization and there's more catalogs, there's more variety, so it's harder to summarize. So there's not a lot of good stuff yet, but maybe in, I don't know, give me 5 years ish. And until then, we're going to get a bunch of stuff up on the website, and then you'll just have access to it.
Fantastic.
And then the last question, any evidence of upper class pursuit of equitation or dressage in the colonies like William Cavendish did in England? And yes, I think there is. So one of our, in fact, those slides that I didn't do at the end was talking about our sites at JeffPat. So the Mac Lab is located at Jefferson Patterson Park and Museum, and we have a public archaeology program. And for about 20 years, they did public archaeology at a site called Smith St. Leonard. And that site was occupied 1711 to 1754, and it had a stable, a very early stable, which is odd because we just don't find them. Like all the Colonial Williamsburg architectural historians were like mind blown because they were like, we don't find these. They don't, I know of one other, a couple of other documents of people that are his contemporaries that had stables, but they haven't been found archaeologically. Anyway, Richard Smith Jr., who lived there, I believe he built the house. His son Walter inherited the property from him in 1715, and I think he was doing this dressage thing in the tradition of William Cavendish, because he built a stable that could house 8 horses. And not only is there a bunch of artifacts in this stable, like spurs and stirrups and all the usual things, I think there might be a cavesson, which is a training, it's like a noseband used for training where that you put the reins on. And then also that site or sites associated with him are 2 of the 3 sites in Maryland where I've seen that metal pommel are associated with that family, that time period. And like I said, that at that time was only being used as for training saddles. It was out of favor for general everyday saddles. So because there's the cavesson, because there's the stable, because there's the pommels, I think that there's definitely evidence that it's not only training, but that he had elite horses, that he was doing the breeding thing, that he probably was practicing dressage. It's my best guess anyway. I have a whole other paper on that. That's 20 minutes.
Oh, well, then.
So that was my my paper for the Mid-Atlantic Conference, was all about the Smith St. Leonard site and how I think there's really something going on there.
Huh.
Yeah.
So, do we have any other questions? It's been a really great lecture, Sarah. I've enjoyed it immensely.
Oh, something popped up.
Nope. Okay, so the comment is, in the 18th century, is there any record of commerce, trade, selling of feed, hay, etc., between producers / growers and horse owners, i.e. merchants, advertising, etc., or were horse owners typically self-sufficient in producing / providing feed for their own animals, or did they rely heavily on pasturing? That's a really big question, and I'm going to venture that, at least from my perspective, at this site, at the Rogers Tavern, it might have been a combination of both, where you had some pasture area for travelers' horses, and then you also had the plantation that the tavern was originally a part of. So you had this massive plantation that would have also potentially been supplying at least a rural tavern at the same time, with maybe some other maybe a small garden for incidental growing of things. But what do you think, Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think the plantations were fairly self-sufficient. I think in the 18th century, there's a lot of changes happening where in the 17th century, people are just establishing their plantations. And as the first half of the 18th century goes on, there's kind of this consolidation that happens where there's the successful planters swallowing up kind of the smaller planters. And so, you know, you get this kind of class divide happening. And so people kind of, the small plantation, the small planter sort of gets absorbed into these larger, more successful ventures over the course of the 18th century in large part. And as that happens, the plantations get bigger, and they are definitely self-sufficient. But like I said, in order to have a license to have an ordinary or tavern, and there's many more of those as the 18th century goes on, you have to be able to provide the feed, the pasture, the stabling, etc. And so I don't know if they're having to source that from outside, or if just the periodic sort of slow nature of the courthouse gathering and things like that allows it to recover in between, or that they just have enough. I don't really know the answer to that question.
And I think maybe region might have something to do with it too, because up here in Cecil County, you know, we're spinning distance from Pennsylvania and from Delaware. So agricultural shifted from primarily tobacco it shifted from tobacco to grains much earlier than it did in the lower Chesapeake.
Yeah, and there's also, because there's that Pennsylvania connection up there, that's just the general settlement patterns and kind of that whole the Pennsylvania Dutch, the Quaker influence, you know, the migration. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the book, it's like Albion Seed, or
Yeah. Mhm.
it's
It's
such a
on my
great
reading
book.
list. It's been there for like
Oh,
20 years,
it's
but eventually I'll get
it's
around to
so
it.
good, and it really talks about these waves of immigrants coming in and how they're coming from different parts of England, different kinds of attitudes, and the tobacco plantation mentality is really coming out of like English gentry, and so the horse culture is really coming over with them full-fledged in their head, and then they're like, oh hey, this is so easy here, you know, like I can have so many horses. Whereas the Pennsylvania people coming in are like really motivated tradespeople. And so there's like settlers all over the place up there. And so you guys might be in this sort of what we love in archaeology to call the liminal space, where you're in this kind of transition between the tobacco culture and the Pennsylvania culture, where they might have a lot more combination kinds of things going on.
Yeah. All right.
Sure.
So we've got last couple questions. So where can we find out more about equestrian history in this area? And then someone would like to connect with you about dressage.
Yeah, I mean, so equestrian history in general, I'm not sure. I'm very much in an archaeology bubble. And because I'm not a horse person, I have kind of deliberately made myself stick to just primary documents to understand only 17th and 18th century attitudes towards horses, because I don't want to look at like a modern day bit and how that's used and extrapolate and that interpretation, impose it on a past bit. Anyway, so I know though that there are organizations that someday I want to reach out to, like the Maryland Horse Board. There's an equestrian board, there's an equestrian. Anyway, there's like state agencies and like, you know, people I should probably be partnering with. They probably have more general history. The one thing I would recommend, there was a blog that Jean Russo out of the state archives did years ago, but it's still on there, and it's Anna Rundle's Horses. And so she just did little blog entries where she would do little factoids about various topics, and that's a good source. She's the one who talked about like what it takes to ship a horse over and when we got horses and things like that. So Jean Russo's blog, it's called Anna Rundle's Horses, I think. That's a good one. But yeah, in terms of, I mean, Jen, can you give her my email?
Yes.
Do you?
Yes,
Okay, if you have contact info, just give her my email.
So so go ahead and email the Rogers Tavern Museum at rtmuseum@perryvillemd.org, and I can connect you with Sarah.
Oh, I pushed answer live. I'll put my email in the chat too.
So there's also the International Museum of Horse. I'm going to do a shout out for them. They are in Lexington, Kentucky.
Yes. I just
I would start there.
threw my email in. Yeah, and there's an international, there's a museum of sport in Western Virginia that I've been wanting to go to, that they have fellowships to do research, and they have a really great archive of like 16th century bit books from Germany, you know, and I'm like, I gotta get out there. Wow. Okay. All right, I don't know if it came through, but I responded with a email to one question. Anyway.
Well, but anywho, so if you have additional questions, Sarah, if you want to give us your contact info.
Oh,
if you have questions.
I can put it in the chat.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we'll go ahead and wrap up since it is almost 6:45. But it's just been so much fun.
Oh, good. Yeah, I know. I think I was like, oh, I think I'm probably over my time, but I didn't account for the intro. I always forget to do that. Okay, my email's in the chat if you want to just email directly.
Okay, and thank you, Janice, for posting the link to the blog that Sarah was
Yes,
mentioning.
thank you.
So thank
Yeah,
you so much for that.
sure.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for agreeing to give us a lecture tonight about colonial horse culture. It's been fun. My own personal opinion,
Yeah.
but I'm a little bit of a horse geek anyway.
Yeah, no, and it's always important to me to make sure that I give this talk to the horse people so that they can call me out, because I only know 17th and 18th century. They can be like, this doesn't make any sense, like and I need that. I need to make sure that I have those checks. So hopefully you guys are all horse enthusiasts and didn't see anything egregious. Or if you did, you can email me and tell me.
And I'd also like to thank everyone for attending tonight and for your questions too. So this lecture has been recorded and we'll post it up to the museum's website as soon as we can. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a great evening.
Okay, thank you.